Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, zerilli-marimò. I'm very happy to host this event here tonight. First of all, because I just got a beautiful present. It's a book on Curzio Malaparte's home in Capri. I believe it's one of the most beautiful, grazie Franco, one of the most beautiful homes ever, with a fantastic view over the Bay of Capri. So to me, I've already done my earning for tonight. But kidding aside, it's the second book of the New York Review of Books publishing that we present this semester. Some of you might have been here for the presentation of two books by Iris Origo. And today we present this new translation of Kremlin Ball by Curzio Malaparte. And we were talking briefly before with my colleagues and friends here. And Malaparte is a much more complicated author, much more difficult to grasp, and still somehow surrounded by a halo of maudit, of cursed author. And maybe that's something that we want to get into a little bit further. And we have the fortune of having with us tonight Jana Mcphee, who is the director of the Center for Applied Liberal Arts here at New York University. She's also a professor and teaches in the Master in Translation. She's an author in her own right, but as a translator, she has already translated Natalia Ginsburg, and we presented here last year, I believe, her translation, Leopardi, Primo Levi, and Curzio Malaparte that we are presenting tonight. And with her to talk about this new translation of Malaparte, we have Franco Baldasso, that we can very proudly say earned his PhD in Italian literature here at the Casa in the Department of Italian Studies, and is now the director of the program in Italian Studies at Bard College. Franco published a book on the Holocaust survivor Primo Levi, Il cerchio di gesso, Primo Levi narratore testimone. This was in 2007, it was just before coming here even. That year, okay. And co-edited with Simona Wright an issue of Namely Italian Studies titled Italy in World War II and the Transition to Democracy, Memory, Fiction, and Histories. He also published articles in Modern Language Notes, Romance Notes, and many other publications. We invited him to discuss with Jenny because one of his fields of interest is indeed Malaparte, that was one also of the protagonists of his PhD dissertation. So without further ado, I would like to ask you to welcome Jana Mcphee and Franco Baldasso. Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to Casa Italiana, which has been my casa for 7 years. And I'm glad to be here also to discuss about Curzio Malaparte, one of the most controversial and yet flamboyant and even, I would say, alluring authors of modern Italian literature. Before asking Jenny to introduce her own relationship with this writer, that is a difficult and yet fascinating writer, I would like to say some things about his life, and then because his life was a novel in his own way. So he was born in Prato in 1898, but at the age of 16 he left the family and he said he was 18 years old, and he moved to France because France was under attack by the Germans in First World War, and despite he was 16 years old, he fought on the front, on the French front, even before Italy reached the conflagration. Just to tell you the kind of guy that left the family and crossed Europe all alone, saying that he was older than he was, and then when he came back, he became like one of the heroes of First World War, and he received the gas in France again that would lead him to his death later on. But just to tell you that this says a lot of his attitude of being always in the very center, even against all odds, in the very center of the politics and of not just politics maybe, but also where things were really happening. And after this experience in the war, he went back to Italy. No, actually, he was following the diplomatic body of Italy at Versailles, and then he was an attaché in Warsaw, in Poland. So he was a first-hand witness of the war between the Russians and the Poland. And from there came possibly one of his great love of his life, the love for Russia, for the revolution that this book represents in such a discomforting but also original way. After that, just to continue with the novel of his life, he got back, and he was one of the first intellectuals in Italy to abide to what Mussolini founded in 1919, the fasci di combattimento. So he was considered actually one of the biggest ideologues of fascism. And for 10 years, he wrote as a I would say, convinced fascist, because he thought that fascism would be the new revolution, bringing modernity to Italy. What happened right after? Just to go on with the novel. Of course, when he started, he became like a director of La Stampa, third newspaper in Italy, and in that role, he traveled all around Europe, and he traveled explicitly in Russia to see how the revolution was going on, and he wrote articles that Mussolini didn't like at all, because he was saying, hey, that revolution is going very well, or at least it was shedding light on something that was unpublishable in Italy. What happened? Success ensued, because then he published this book called Technique de coup d'état, technique of the revolution, of the coup d'état, of taking power, and it was published in French. He was not allowed to publish it in Italian, but that book was like, with that book he became like a sort of literary star all over Europe, and was of course translated within months in the United States. And but when he got back, of course, fascism then was not anymore happy with his conduct and with his free spirit. So they confined him in a small little island just to have him quiet for some years, because his presence became problematic. He was the most famous fascist writer, and yet he was critical of the regime. Just a few more notes about him. When he finally was able to go back, to reacquire a position, he was sent to Ethiopia, was sent to the Balkans as a journalist for Corriere della Sera, and even during Second World War, what was most amazing, he was criticizing the Germans in a way that were unexpected and clearly not, they didn't follow what the regime prescribed. But the problem is that they couldn't censor his articles, because every time he was writing an article about the German front and the struggle between Germany, Italy, and Russia, Corriere della Sera was selling 200,000 copies more. I'm talking about 1941, so you can understand how strong was his presence, even in Italian life. And then he published another book about Russia called the Volga Rises in Europe. After the war, he switched political ideas, and there was a brief alliance with the Communist Party, but then he fled Italy, because his presence was, he was clearly persona non grata as a former ideologue of fascism. So he went to Paris, and in Paris he worked out, after publishing possibly his masterpiece, Caput, which is the story of Europe under the yoke of the Germans, and it's an incredible novel, incredibly gruesome novel, but extremely fascinating to the heart of darkness of what was Europe. Then he published another book that became a scandal, and it was about, the book was called La Pelle, the skin. With this book, basically, the mayor of Naples issued a local law that he couldn't enter in Naples for all his life, because the book was was such a big scandal. It was narrating something that Italian critics said it was much better to be an hypocrite than narrating these stories, because those were the stories of Italian prostitution to the Allies, according to Malaparte. After this, a film after this travels in South America, travels to China, and then he died in 1957 because of the gas that he inhaled when he was 16 years old in France. I just wanted to introduce his life because he then remained a sort of persona non grata in the Italian literature and also in certain cultural situation because of his, maybe because of his weird honesty and because of his writing that is really, really unique. And I'm very glad to have Jenny here, who made a fantastic feat of translating the Kremlin Ball, one of his novels. And I don't know, maybe the best way to introduce Malaparte in this book is asking your relation to this book and how you come to translate this book.
Sure. So I have, I was in speaking with Franco, we were talking about, he was going to ask me this question, so I put together a little slideshow for you all about my relationship with Curzio Malaparte. So translation is generally, literary translation is generally a labor of love. So if you decide that you're going to translate something, you're embarking on a very intimate relationship with the author, dead or alive. And you're going to be living with all the foibles of that author. You're going to be thinking about every word and comma many times over in the text. So you definitely don't want to translate anybody that's going to irritate you or from whom you can't learn anything. So also in my trajectory as a translator, I have become something of a translation activist in the sense that there's this horrible number that if you're in translation circles you will hear about all the time, which is 3%. And so 3% of all books published in English in America and in the UK are in translation. So in other countries, in Europe and Asia, that's more anywhere from 30 to 60% of the books will be in translation. But in the US, we only publish 3%, which may contribute to our sort of provincial, inward-looking attitude. So that said, of that 3%, 25% are women authors from other countries. So I had pretty much decided that I was only translating women. And I just translated Natalia Ginsburg and Edwin Frank, who is the editor of New York Review Books, came to me and he said, well, I have this project. It's Curzio Malaparte and it's unfinished. And do you want to do it? And I was thinking, oh, I mean, how can I take that on? But of course, Curzio Malaparte I'd had a sort of relationship in my life as a writer and a human being, and I sort of couldn't say no. He intrigued me too much. He was too much of a weird, interesting character as for me to not want to actually truly engage with him. And I also knew that he was a really exquisite writer. And one thing about being both a writer and a translator is that I learn most about what it is to be a writer by translating. I have learned the most, for sure, by being in a text and being with language so profoundly in that way as a translator. So I knew Malaparte had a lot to teach me just on that level. So, my knowledge of Malaparte was not extensive. I had associations and references, which I'll tell you about, and he did figure very briefly in a novel that I wrote and published in 2007. So I'd been hearing about him for years. Especially in Italy. And when he was spoken about by my friends in Italy, it was always with this kind of weird mixture of shame and a little pride, but mostly shame. And they just would sort of switch the conversation and move it away. Some would say fascista, and the others would say comunista. All of them would say opportunista. And so, he was never really embraced as any kind of national literary treasure. But everyone acknowledged that he was a guy that was seriously talented, if morally corrupt. And Franco's incredible article that he wrote really has revealed a lot to me about Malaparte. It's Curzio Malaparte and the Tragic Understanding of Modern History. So maybe later on we can get deeper into why Italians really rejected Malaparte. But so how I knew Malaparte was really this book, I Maledetti Toscani, which is translated as those cursed Tuscans. So I fell in love with Italy when I was 17 and on a grand tour of Italy with my best friend. We were both blonde and seriously harassed, but still the culture and the language, and for the most part the people, fascinated and intrigued me on some deep gut level. And then I did my junior year abroad at the University of Florence. I had a horrible year. When I left, I swore I would never set foot in that town again. And then a year later, I met a Florentine, and we soon got married. So I have been in that town every year since I was 24. Never say never. So my difficulty with Florence, of course, was the Florentines, and they are perfectly summed up by Malaparte's book on the peculiar, self-deprecating, pessimistic, provincial arrogance of the Tuscans. So, and that pretty much kind of explains that. But it's a fantastic book, and so that was my first knowledge of him. Then, as Franco was saying, many in Italy associate Malaparte with fascism, and for good reason, because he was so much a part of the fascist regime and marched on Rome with Mussolini, and he was a supporter of even eventually Hitler. And then by 1929, which is when the Kremlin Ball takes place, Malaparte was becoming disillusioned with the fascist regime and saw communism as a new ideological hope. And he was still very much in favor with the fascist regime, and he got himself sent as a journalist and an Italian diplomat to Moscow for a year to describe this new ideal government run with efficiency and enthusiasm by the working class. The resulting series of articles, which Franco mentioned, in praise of Lenin was published in La Stampa, and at the time it apparently so infuriated Mussolini that he suggested Malaparte apply for a job at Pravda. So what Malaparte found instead in Moscow is the subject of the Kremlin Ball, and it describes the Soviet leadership as really nothing more than a new aristocracy that had simply replaced the old, and that this new elite, even if they had overthrown the bourgeoisie, was itself bourgeois to the core. But he didn't start writing this book until 1946, and it was an outtake of The Skin, and he never actually finished writing it. So, as Franco mentioned, in 1933, Malaparte and fascism finally parted ways. Mussolini exiled his pet writer to the Aeolian island of Lipari, apparently for insulting Italo Balbo, a fascist government minister. Do you know that story?
Yeah, totally.
So I've been to Lipari, by the way, and it's paradise on earth, so it wasn't exactly exile. But while he was there, he was inspired by the local architecture, and he spent his time planning his dream house, which he would later build on the island of Capri, known as the Casa Malaparte, which is this book that has been given to Stefano is all about that. So here's that house. So in my third novel, A Man of No Moon, it's very loosely based on the writer Cesare Pavese's love affair with the American actress Dorothy Dowling, who was working in Cinecittà at the time, and it's set in post-war Italy. And a chapter takes place on the island of Capri, even though I've never been there. And on the ferry over to Capri from Naples, the Pavese character, who's called Dante Sabato, picks up the latest gossip about the island's illustrious regulars, including Graham Greene, Axel Munthe, Norman Douglas, the Nazi-sympathizing Krupp family, the American beauty Mona Harrison Williams, and of course, Curzio Malaparte. And so this Dante in my novel this is what he says about Malaparte. The writer Curzio Malaparte, forever fickle and contrary in his politics, author of the damning and derisive Caput, the best piece of writing about the war yet to be published, had returned to his self-built bunker-style villa to work on a new book, apparently excoriating the Allied liberation. That would have been the skin. So it seems Malaparte already had future plans for me. He was already talking to me about the fact that I would be translating him someday. So anyway, I've never been to Capri, but I'm dying to go. And this incredibly strange house is considered one of the most remarkable examples of modern European architecture. And the New York Times critic, Herbert Mouchon, calls it the most beautiful house in the world. And apparently, Malaparte fired the original architect and built the place himself together with a local stonemason. But I also knew this house from one of my favorite films, which is Le Méprise, which is based on a novel by Alberto Moravia, Il Disprezzo, and that's Brigitte Bardot and Michel Piccoli. So as Franco mentioned, here, the books, if Malaparte is known in America, it's really for these two books that the New York Review of Books brought out, one in 2007, this one, Caput, in a new translation, and The Skin in 2013, and then now the Kremlin Ball. And so, yes. So, and we can talk about this further. Malaparte, in his day, was really one of the intellectual elite, and he was very much a part of the artists' world in Italy and Europe. And Europe and beyond. I mean, he was really considered. And but then he just fell completely out of nobody read him. But you were saying earlier.
Yeah, I mean, this is from one of our conversation. Besides the fact that I teach Malaparte, and his writing is very controversial for the ideological reason, for his depictions of prostitution and sex and so on and so forth, and also of race. I have to say that my students love it, because it's really a unique writer that brings literature to another level. He builds his novels around this figure as a sort of witness of the war, like in the Kremlin Ball that we're going to describe in details, of the corruption of the new nobility in Russia, and as a sort of how can I say, one of the first cases of auto-fiction in European literature is always going beyond the boundaries between realism and magical realism. In a way that you don't really understand whether all the stories that he's telling that are about Lenin, Trotsky in this case, but also the great figures of fascism in Caput and of Nazism in Caput, they are real or not. And still everything is kind of titillating and real. So this photo is amazing because in the 20s and 30s, Malaparte was really one of the great European intellectuals. We were discussing before how after publishing Technique du coup d'etat, and again, it was published in French because of course, the capital of world letters was Paris back then, until the 50s, until New York became the real capital, the new capital of world letters and of art. He published his books in French. So all the intellectuals of Europe could discuss them. So the scandal, he was one of the first, together maybe with D'Annunzio, to understand the role of intellectual as someone that could provoke scandal and really shake the public opinion. Here is with Vittorio De Sica, Jean Cocteau, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Interestingly enough, the biographies of Malaparte in France, in France, they sell a lot, because he's been completely translated, and there are conferences going on in France. He's put on the same level as another great French writer who had a very troublesome, problematic past, like Céline. And by the way, the two, Céline and Malaparte, met each other. Malaparte at a certain point wanted to give money to Céline, because you're saying, despite you are, of course, biased with the French fascists, you are not one of the best writers on earth. So just with that, and Céline was the author of Voyage à bout de la nuit, great novel talking about all the sins, I would say the sins of the new bourgeoisie, or the French ideals that started as something like to recreate a new world in Europe and outside of Europe, but then they became hollow cages. So a writer like that was was in constant dialogue with the great writers of the time. In my research, I saw also like the cover of the Times, of the New York Times Literary Supplement in 1946, when Malaparte's books were reviewed, and of course were reviewed like these books are great, but the guy is morally biased, and that is something that kept also his appreciation, especially in Italy, because after his death, I mean, he died in 1957, sorry. Before his death, he was really a public figure. After his death, I think also a lot of Italian writers worked toward like putting him aside.
Making him disappear a bit, yeah.
Yeah, making him disappear, because he was honest about all the skeletons in the closet that European intellectual had. Jenny was saying before how in the 20s he took part in the March on Rome, and then became much more close to communism. The problem is that generation of European intellectual wanted revolution. So if fascism is not working, communism maybe will. And he was one of the few that were admitting that publicly. Whereas most of the other writers, especially in Italy, maybe they changed alliances overnight after the Second World War, but they were not clear about their past. It was much better to forget everything that was before. Malaparte instead puts the finger exactly on the wound, on where all the other writers, all the other intellectuals, all the politicians didn't want to talk about their past as fascists, that then became, maybe the new politician for the left, maybe the new politician for the Christian Democrats, and therefore it's much better to forget about a figure that is undermining the great cliché, the great stereotype of Italiani brava gente, and Italiani brava gente meaning the Italians. Yeah, they were fascists, but actually all the guilt was Mussolini's. So he said something completely different. And what is remarkable about this book, and I'm asking you also now to introduce it specifically, that besides Italians, he's also said the same thing about Europeans, about Russians. So there was no one in Europe that was completely innocent in his novels. Therefore, it could become the perfect scapegoat for an intellectual class that had a lot of skeletons in the closet. And yeah, maybe we can...
Yeah, we'll talk about that more. I mean, a big theme for him is, it's really the subject of evil. And so is the evil, are we going to separate the phenomenon of fascism or totalitarianism separated away from who we are as a people, as humans, or is it an expression of actually who we are, and then how do we deal with that? So after World War II, I think Italians really did not. They wanted to make Mussolini, Hitler, the whole mechanization of horror, an aberration and something separate and over there, and then the good people are over here. And he refused to do that, absolutely. He saw that part and parcel of who we are. So that's in part, too, I think, why he was so rejected, because he was insisting that everybody say, look, we have to deal with this. Totalitarianism is sort of a natural thing that we go for, unless there are checks and so on. But I'm going to just finish my little thing. See, he was sort of eternally, in his deep cynicism, he was also eternally hopeful. He thought, oh, look, Mao's starting this great new revolution, and I'm going to go and see what's going on there. And I'm sure he would have written amazing takedowns of that, too. But he died the following year. So that's him going to China. And then, of course, when somebody's reputation is being revived, you get a stamp. So he was Adelphi, actually, which is a very respected publisher in Italy. They brought Malaparte's books back out in special editions in the 90s. And so he has been having something of a renaissance there and now here, and the stamp proves it.
If I may add something, is that what is interesting I was checking the numbers of how much Malaparte sold all over these years. And despite in Italian academia it was considered a sporcaccione, like something dirty guy, he kept on selling hundreds of thousands of copies throughout the 20th century, meaning that his books, especially The Skin and La Pelle, that together with the Kremlin Ball form a sort of trilogy, they were read on and on and on, because they were representing all the things that the public sphere was not addressing. So in a way, we have a writer that was not considered high literature. On the other, you have the same writer kept on being alive in the Italian market, in the French market, in the European market. I mean, this summer that was really interesting. I went to Belgrade, and I mean, which Italian books you find in a bookstore in Belgrade, and I found Primo Levi and Curzio Malaparte.
I was in the airport the other day, and Malaparte, 3 of his books were there. I mean, so it was astonishing. Yeah. In Italy. So I just love this quote from Gary and Diana, because it's really true about Malaparte, that he created a new genre, really. I mean, a new way of writing that then subsequently was adopted by other writers, or other writers came to. He was really so way ahead of his time, and postmodern before there was postmodern. And his style is, he is the protagonist himself of all of his work. And you never know where truth or fiction where the boundary is at all in his work. And what he's always trying to get at, whether he's exaggerating some fantastic story or whether it's really, and all the characters pretty much are all real people. He's really speaking to the idea that art and literature can get at the truth, as exaggerated as it is, or so he's really playing with that boundary all the time in his work, and I find that really fascinating how he does that. He's also just an incredibly beautiful writer too, very specific, very compelling work. And yeah, he's known as Don Camilione because he switches sides all the time. And that's sort of my little
So, how do you come to translate the Kremlin Ball? And if you want to say something about this novel, we said it is ideally part of a trilogy, and you anticipated it started as a sort of a side project. Probably at the beginning was one of the chapters of The Skin, which is one of the most famous of his books, and but then it developed as a full-fledged project, a project that is not finished though. So maybe can you introduce the most important themes and the characters of besides himself that we said is at the center of it's like the camera of his films in a way. Mm-hmm.
Yes, so I actually think maybe what I should do is just read 5 minutes from it so that you can get a feel for it, because I could tell you, but it's not the same as just actually hearing him. And then we can talk a little bit more. So this is one of my favorite sections. It's just short. One Sunday morning, I went to the flea market on Smolensky Boulevard with Bulgakov. Every Sunday morning, all those who were left of Moscow's former nobility, all the well-bred, miserable ghosts of the Tsarist aristocracy, gathered on the sidewalks of Smolensky Boulevard to sell their meager treasures to foreign diplomats, to those enriched by the revolution, to the net men, to communist profiteers, to the new Marxist nobility, to the wives, daughters, and lovers of the new red boyars. They gathered to sell their last snuff box, their last ring, their last icon, their last silver medallions, toothless combs, torn and faded silk scarves, used gloves, Cossack daggers, old shoes, silver bracelets, German and Russian porcelain, ancient Tatars, scimitars, their last tattered French books, their last old and dramatic women's hats from the Anna Karenina era, all puffed up with feathers, clownish, naive, and befuddling. Sitting on canvas chairs along the tree-lined avenue running up the middle of Smolensky Boulevard, or standing along the edge of the sidewalk under the green trees, those sad phantoms of the Ancien Regime's nobility chatted amongst themselves for hours about all the daily events in their lives: weddings, funerals, divorces, engagements, suicides, intrigues, scandals, gossip, as if they were sitting in the drawing room of a neoclassical mansion in Belgorod, the White Town, designed by Beauvais, in the fabulous era of their glory, of their joyful, happy youth. They chatted amongst themselves in the French of Madame du Deffand, adapted to the slight Muscovite accent of the Countess of Ségur, born Rostopchine, bowing to one another continuously, turning to one and then the other with graceful gestures of the head and hands like a ballet of dolls in a theater at court, interrupting themselves every so often to attend to passers-by, their voices piercing and plaintive. "Look at this trinket, monsieur. A souvenir of Moscow, monsieur. A pretty Russian souvenir, monsieur." On Arbat Street, we met an old, short man, at once stocky and fragile, with bushy white mutton chops, who walked hunched over while balancing on his head an enormous gilded armchair. It was a Louis-Philippe chair, covered in red damask, resting on top of an old black English hat in the shape prescribed by Edward VII. That narrow, curled-up brim in the Baroque fashion, the Edwardian style perpetuating both in hats and literature, the Bath style. Precisely and only in its faithfulness to the hats of Edward VII's era, Tsarist Russia revealed the dark presentiment of its approaching doom. That man carrying the armchair on his head seemed to be one of those old women in Goya's Capriccios who wore a chair on her head. Bulgakov went up to him, greeting him cordially and without familiarity. "Bonjour, bonjour," the old man said, his voice shrill and vicious. He was Prince Lvov, who in 1917 was the last president of the Duma. The old man's face was shiny with sweat, and he appeared exhausted by his hard work. He put the chair down on the sidewalk, plopped himself into it, then used a dirty handkerchief to wipe his forehead. He said he'd come to Smolensky Boulevard convinced that he would finally be able to sell his armchair. "Gilded armchairs are back in fashion," he said. He had 5 more at home, a treasure trove, he added. That would allow him to keep going for a couple more years. "Then we'll see, ha ha ha," he exclaimed, laughing. He laughed while closing his eyes and shrugging his shoulders, all hunched over as if he had been stricken by a fit of coughing. Suddenly he opened his eyes and, turning to me, asked if I knew X, who, before the revolution, was the Italian ambassador in St. Petersburg. He smiled as he spoke, calling me jeune homme, and every so often marveling at my shoes, my suit, and my hat. Do they all dress as you do in Europe? It's a strange way to dress. The tailors over there must have lost their minds. In my day, and he started to count the buttons on my jacket, amazed that there were only 3. He counted the buttons on his own jacket and said, 4. That's the cardinal rule, jeune homme. Not even the communist revolution was able to rip the 4th button off my jacket. He shook his head with disgust at my shoes with their thick soles and low heels, fastened with thin leather shoelaces, and after a while he said triumphantly that he wouldn't exchange his shoes for mine for all the gold in the world. He wore black ankle boots, scuffed and torn, that buttoned on the side. Mm-hmm. So I particularly like that passage. I mean, they're all like that. I mean, it's just so dark, but yet so beautifully specific about what is going on in Moscow at that time, and the sort of changing of the regime, but the regime just really not changing. And one of the themes in Malaparte in general is that he questions this whole idea of progress and whether or not are we really going somewhere and getting better as humanity, or are we just doomed to keep repeating ourselves?
Yeah. Well, now that you are reading this, and I read these novels many times, and I also read your beautiful translation, because Malaparte's allure is also in his own writing that is so full of images, and also of peculiar images. Very, very. He's a very creative writer, not just a narrator, but he's able to depict all scenarios that look like paintings, and actually paintings and fashion and theater is always on the forefront of his writing. But I was thinking, maybe because I'm reading right now the Leopard, Il Gattopardo by Tomasi di Lampedusa, another great writer that made of a theater and of nobility one of the main objects of his representations. That one line, maybe the most famous line of the Leopard that talks about Sicily, is the fact that everything has to change in order to
stay the same.
Exactly, in order to have everything to stay the same. Malaparte was writing the same 15 years before Tomasi di Lampedusa regarding the Russian Revolution, which is a blasphemy in Europe to write something about that in 1946. We have to remember that the war was just over, and the Russian won the war against the Nazis. A book like that, probably he realized himself that it's going to give me not just scandals, but probably nowhere to go in Europe. I will have to go back to China or something like that, because although he was describing experiences that he had 20 years before when he visited that society, he's describing a society that was seen by most of Italian and European intellectuals as il sol dell'avvenir, as the possibility of a new dawn for humanity. And he's instead saying that in order to have the revolution or to have the proletarian thrive, everything else has just remained the same. Meaning we had just a substitution of elites. And the new elite is condemned to doom by fear, which is something that was not in Ancien Regime. Why condemned by fear? Because in the entire novel, one of the characters that is never described, but is always there, of course, is Stalin. Stalin is watching the Bolshoi ballet, probably is also the lover of the main star of the ballet. Stalin is part of the discussion of the Kremlin Ball, where all these beautiful ladies and all diplomats are discussing about what to wear or the problems of how to represent the proletariat, because that is the real the new big deal of Russian art. But the protagonist is not there. So I love the fact that, as in other Malaparte books, there is always a ghastly atmosphere. The real people are already ghosts because, as we know, and few people in Europe knew as Malaparte did, most of the people that are represented in this book, few years later, despite their grandeur here, they will be part of the first Stalin's purge. They will all be killed, all as enemy of the revolutions. And we are already at the second level because, of course, they are, Malaparte is addressing most of them like, weren't you a friend of Trotsky? And everybody is kind of denying this because being a friend of Trotsky in the late 20s in Russia meant that you were a counter-revolutionary, and therefore you were afraid for your own life, for life for your own family. So he's describing, again, this book was thought in the 40s, in the late 40s, he's describing the revolution got bad. Which is, again, something that was really, really unique at the time. When I was,
I really like that distinction between how the old elite maintained power. So how he sees this. So the old elite, which was the royalty and the nobility, they just knew they were going to have power forever and be squashing the peasants and so on. And they were never worried about it because they just assumed it would always be that way. But then what changes, as you were saying, is that the new elites know that their time is short. So they actually are ruling in this kind of very fearful way. And, you know, this idea of what is so wrong with society in that he points out all the time about the ruling elite and how they're not willing they say they're going to do something for the people, but actually just use that as an excuse to keep the power. You know, it's very relevant to where we are right now.
Absolutely.
And I kept, when I was translating this book over and over again, you know, and I was just shocked at how he was predicting really where we are today.
Yeah, in a way, of course, prescient of what is power, because we have to say something about Malaparte. He was always in the bottom room. First in the fascist regime, then as a journalist in the main fronts of the Second World War, before even during First World War, when he was like a polyglot young man following the Italian diplomats in Versailles. So he was also able to be in that situation, to understand totalitarianism from within, authoritarian regimes from within, and also understand when the society were beginning to rot. In one of his plays that is in French, and there was another scandal when he went out, unfortunately difficult to find out. The title is Du côté de chez Proust. He has Proust, one of the great icons of French civilization, describing his own failures because, as a matter of fact, the main object of his own books is how society rot. In a way, you can see that Malaparte is describing himself through Proust. But part of his genius, I would say, is just finding the wrong thing to say in the right moment. Going to Paris and talking badly about Proust. Going to Russia and asking weird questions about Stalin. And again, if you read Caput, which is another great book, the Germans are described in a way that was very, very problematic. And the book has been published in 1944. Another thing that we can say about Caput, which is, again, in continuation with this book, is that in 1944, most of the European Jews, especially the ones in the Balkans, were not even reached by the Holocaust. And he published that book in which he's describing the Einsatzkommando in Ukraine or the ghetto in Warsaw. So addressing issues that for that moment were not even timely. Only later on we discussed about the Holocaust, but Malaparte was able, despite he was a former fascist, of describing things exactly when they were happening. So this is very disquieting of him, in a way. You have an incredibly insightful writers and still someone who had the alliance with power, as we were saying.
Yeah, no, it's very... So in terms of, in terms of the translation itself, I did learn a lot and was very amazed at his just vision. It was also extremely difficult to do because it's unfinished. So there are many places where he's repeating himself. There's a lot, and half of it, well, no, let's say a third was in French. So I also had to make the decision about how much of the French do I translate, because one of his in doing that, in having a third of it be in French, he was also showing how the elite in Moscow was actually still hanging on to those old traditions of speaking in French. So even the Bolsheviks were still maintaining the French language. So then in the translation, of course, you want to include that feeling, but again, for an American audience, it couldn't be a third in French. So I had to weigh how to do that, and so that was difficult. And then also just it was heavily annotated, but I thought then with Edwin Frank, for an American audience, I don't think that we needed the scholarly edition. I think just to have it read as something semi-finished. Yeah. So it was tough, but great.
Well, definitely a daunting experience to translate such a difficult book. But I also introduced the book, and I found very compelling what you said about Marika. Marika is the only, not the only female character. There are many female characters, but it's a very peculiar character. And why you picked Marika to start your introduction?
Well, as I say in the introduction, she seems to be, the whole book takes place with him wandering around Moscow to different parties, to different locations, to see Lenin's tomb, to see graveyard, various places. And she's always going, they go to see Mayakovsky's room after he's commits suicide. And she's always with him. And it's interesting because when I wrote the introduction, she just struck me as a Virgil-like character going around with him. And then afterwards, when reading your article, it comes up again that there's a Virgil-like character in Caput.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that must have been very much on his mind, that she was sort of his guide to this new world in Moscow. And yet she was she was a believer in the whole new possibility of the communist regime, but she was also skeptical, and she was also really deeply appreciative of him. And open to him, even though she calls him "you dirty pig" all the time.
All the time. Every time she talks with him, she's like, "You dirty pig." And, okay.
So another theme in Malaparte is that he doesn't really believe in redemption, although he's obsessed with Christianity, which is a whole big other theme that he knows way more about. But so she's never going to be a figure of redemption in the novel, but she does act as sort of a little sliver of hope.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have a book on Russian nobility, on Soviet nobility rather. But as a matter of fact, Malaparte believes in the people in a way. The proletariat. I mean, he has lunches, dinners with fashionable ballerinas or diplomats, in which the discussions are always and the conversation is always very lofty. But then when he's meandering through throughout the streets of Moscow is interested in how the real people live, which is something that is, I think it comes also from his experience when he was younger in Tuscany, when he was schooled in the most prestigious high school of Tuscany, that is the Liceo Cicognini, but he was living with some peasant. So you have this real love for the peasant, and also, I would say also a love for Christianity as a secular religion, which is extremely problematic throughout this novel, even in the Skin, and even in this film. He made just one film. It's called The Prohibited Christ. The title is already controversial. You have a discussion with this within the Kremlin Ball that is fantastic between him and Lunacharsky. Lunacharsky was one of the important people in the Soviet era regarding Russian culture, because culture was one of the key instruments of propaganda. And Lunacharsky is saying, everyone who comes to Russia, to Soviet Russia, finds God, and they become Christian, even if they were not before. But the book is elaborating an idea of Christianity that in a way goes back to the very foundation, if I may, and not totally unafraid of saying that the institution is one of the many nobility elites that bound to rot, but seeing instead of Christianity as a sort of philosophy, I would say, as a way of perceiving what is common in the human beings, and in other books, even animals. It's a complex feeling, and very often when we were reading, we were discussing about that. You don't understand his religious drive, because he's really trying to go back to an idea of a Christian religion that is before religion as an institution, which is also the great counter-argument to the Russian Revolution, and also the fascist revolution, the Nazi revolution. There have been all sorts of secular religions, like now we assess them. So again, a book that is very complex, many themes, and all in a nutshell. But it's a great read. And I don't know if you want to say something more about.
No, just of course. The translator has to have an incredible hubris to translate, because you're taking on not only a writer's vision and a writer's words, but you're also taking on this whole culture that he's part of. So the amount of reading I had to do, and then I do tons of footnotes, mostly for myself, but then also for the readers, to sort of also place myself there, where he was. But I think might as well open up to questions from you all, if you have them. Yes.
Speaking of coming to Malaparte and how you got to him, I was actually writing and researching a book about my father, who left and translated. He left me 700 letters before he died, and I translated them from French to English by his escape from Nazi-occupied Europe to America and back as an intelligence officer.
Cool.
So I was going through his books in his library after he died, and I saw The Skin, so I had no idea, and I thought, you naughty boy. And I went home and sat down on a cold winter night with a glass of red wine, opened the bottle and some chocolate, and I opened it and I was like, oh my God. And I realized very quickly that I was reading, in my opinion, the Italian Hemingway. And from The Skin to Caput, and started going through all of the books. Thank you. And his descriptions were just informed the way I started to think and research. And he would say something, so I would look up the event. I wanted to see Naples with the volcano and erupting and everything, and I just thought it was really interesting. And then, of course, coming to your book and the translation, and I'm working on my second now about the building that he ran from. It's now the European Union. And when you say, you quote him, everything is true, the people, the events, the things, the places. His truth, however, is inevitably accompanied by an aura
of the incredible. His prose mirrors the incredulity elicited by the outlandish claims of politicians and their ideologies, and then you go on. It's incredible what he does, and it's just such a pleasure to,
It is hard to actually describe it without reading it because it's so unique what he does. And his erudition is amazing. I mean, and it's not just elite, as you say. And when you describe him like being really interested in the people, he wasn't slumming it. You know what I mean? He was really deeply interested in everything that he approached.
And he was
But
like the first embed reporter, is how I think of him.
Exactly, very much like that, but with maybe a Buñuelian take on it all, you know, and ability to describe it in this sort of surrealist, realist way. It's hard. It's really hard to describe.
But I want to thank you for
Yeah.
your
Yeah, thank you.
If
so
I-
exciting.
If I may add something to you addressed the issue with the skin, and I just want to add an anecdote that is very interesting. Jenny was saying exactly. There's a lot of surrealism, and he was one in fascist Italy when nobody was allowed to publicly speak about surrealism. He basically published a whole issue of his journal in 1940, so 2 months before Italy declared war against France, on surrealism, translating himself or Marxist poets that were part of surrealism. And another important thing is that a lot of writers that were Jewish were not allowed to write after 1938. They were all writing for Malaparte's different editorial venues. And this is something to say that now, of course, he was a saint. He was a big sinner and a very interesting sinner, but his figure was so controversial that even those things that were not remembered after the war. And if I may say something about the skin. The Skin now has been republished by New York Review of Books in its complete version, because for 40 years, the American public could read The Skin only with 2 chapters cut that are the most controversial. This has happened a lot with Malaparte's writing because it was just considered immoral.
It's interesting.
Didn't Malaparte leave the house in Capri to the communist government of China?
Yeah, I was going to say that. He didn't actually, but it was a big rumor that he was going to leave it to the Chinese government. It was. I really researched that because I kept seeing it everywhere that he'd left it to the Chinese, and I just thought that would be so great. No, we know the family. He's met the family.
Yeah.
They still own it, and it's now a foundation.
So it's a fact that he did not leave it.
He did not leave it to the Chinese government, but it is a great story. It's very Malapartian that we would.
In the early 60s. And I remember going to the house then, and everyone said it belonged to the Chinese government.
But that was a very long, legal problem because the Chinese government claimed that the.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's very complicated. Yeah, it's very, very complicated because for 40 years, the Chinese government claimed that Malaparte told Mao, because before dying he interviewed Mao Zedong, that, okay, I'm going to give my beautiful house in Capri for the young Chinese writers and artists. The Ronchi, Zuckert, and Rositani Zuckert families that are the hero of Malaparte said, no, there's nowhere to be written. But this is part of the allure of the character who's making a lot of mess, an international mess, out of his own persona. If I may say something about his death became a sort of worldly event for Italy at that time. All the newspaper were talking about newspaper and gossip magazines about his last days when he was in a clinic in Rome. Basically, at his bed, all the important Italian politicians were going. He received the card of the Communist Party, given to him by Togliatti, the secretary of the Communist Party, like the day before he died. And then there were rumors that in the very last moment, one priest from his native Prato, the small town close to Florence, was able to convert him. So it was fun to read all these journals and newspapers from '57 that I did in my research, because you have the Catholic journal say Malaparte is in heaven because we were able, despite he was a sinner, because we were able to, he was baptized at the very last moment. And the communist papers were instead saying, at the very end, he converted too, and our Togliatti was able to show him the right way. So he was really playing with this.
Opportunista
right.
fino alla fine.
I have a question for Jenny. It's personal as a translator. And you said before that you had, at a certain point, decided to translate only women. And the previous translation of yours we presented here was by Natalia Ginsburg. And I can imagine how sympathetic and you must have been towards her as a character, as a writer, and seeing things in common and really identifying yourself. And with Malaparte, we understand that you have a great deal of respect for him as a writer, and at the same time, it's very hard to identify yourself with the writer you're translating. So I was wondering, from a very personal point of view, in your experience of translator, how is it to translate an author like Ginsburg, with whom you can identify and you can see things eye to eye on so many levels, and somebody so different from you, even if you respect him, like Malaparte?
Well,
Which one is more difficult to translate?
Well, okay, so there are two things there. One is it really helps that I'm a writer, because as a writer, I can enter into him as a character, and he becomes one of my a character for me. And then I can enter into his language, his world, and so that is really, really helpful. Of course, with Ginsburg, it was that much easier or more pleasurable, because she was just an inspiration to me from when I was very young, and we're so not alike, but I understood her and wanted to be with her and know her, and he scared me a little bit, but the more, and he is so slippery, and everything with the religion and the elitism, and he was hard to figure out. But once I felt like I really got him as a character, then I could really get in there and enjoy myself. So, and he's actually really enjoyable. Even, he may be a sinner or all of these other things and very tortured, and he's also, I think, fundamentally a really good person. So that was. So, and then the other thing that Gregory Rabassa says, and this is really, I've found to be true in my translating experience, is that the better the writer, ultimately, the easier it is to translate, because translation is all about word choice. You can choose a million different ways to translate something, or a lot of different ways. But if the writer is very precise and very specific, your choices are limited, are down, because there's going to be really not one way, but a very a way that is going to make sense and sound, and because the author, him or herself, has thought about how it sounds, has thought about that word choice very many times over. So it's going to be, it's easier in the end, because it's finally what it's meant to be. And I say that very hesitantly, because translation is so wide open in terms of how it can be, and what if I translate this book or you translate this, or we're all going to get very different versions. There is no one way to translate a book. But I do think what Rabassa said is kind of true, that it becomes an easier task if the writer is a particularly good writer. And this book was unfinished, so he's not even it's not his polished self at all. But even so, he's guiding me right to how it should sound, what he's trying to say, the language that he wants. So.
Thank you.
Book. He also designed costumes and did choreography for the ballet and designed posters.
He certainly.
Well, the
graphic
last
artist.
part of his career, after he made the film, he also made theater and one. I don't remember whether he designed costumes.
In that book, yeah. He certainly put on productions,
Right.
theater productions, and I'm sure he was
Exactly.
involved in every aspect.
Yeah, the fact, for instance, his film, he was in his film, the Il Cristo Proibito, which was actually pretty successful at the time. It was a sort of difficult take with neorealism. It's the story of a person coming back from the front and finding that his reality has completely changed, and finding who killed his brother that nobody in the town wants to say because everybody wants to forget. The entire film, even the music, was done by him, because he really tried to do to reproduce everything like it was in his mind. So in a way, we have a polymath. That's true.
Yeah, and he certainly in his writing he's obsessed with clothes. So he's all the description of the clothes, the Schiaparelli dresses that the ballerinas wear, and then he did build that house himself.
Yeah.
So he's very much a creator as well. Yes.
I was just wondering, from what I remember of the Skin, he was very, very contemptuous of the young communists whom he thought were going to be coming back into Italy after the war. And it just seemed so out of place somehow. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that. And maybe I'm not remembering it correctly. But I seem to remember sections of the book where he was really contemptuous of any of the people who were going to show up in Italy after the war.
There you go.
Okay. Well, that section of the Skin is very compelling, because it was depicting the new generation that came out of the war. They were endorsing Marxism as a sort of counterculture, but a counterculture that allowed them to be free spirits. And that was a sort of also reactionary turn of his. His take on Marxism was clearly biased by his idea that the revolution, even the communist revolution, was totally failing. And so those pages were extremely political, and because he wanted to say that nobody in Europe, and especially in Italy, was innocent. A lot of the people that now were preaching democracy until the night before were fascist to the core. So this contempt for the new Marxist was also a contempt of a new generation that didn't live up to the values that they were preaching. And that you can find something similar even on the Kremlin Ball, because he's clearly criticizing the new Soviet nobility, just because they are totally undermining with their behavior all the values of the people, and for which a lot of people died. His take on Christianity is very interesting, because he's saying that of course he doesn't like Christianity as an institution. Also because he was not Catholic. He came from a family, his father was German, so a family that was Protestant in Italy. But what I wanted to say is that his take of all these of all these newbies, how he would himself call them, was trying to criticize the possibility of taking the revolution not very seriously, like a game, like in something that, okay, you're young, you can be revolutionary, but tomorrow you're not. And even this maybe has been prescient, because there is so much to say about what happened in '68 all over Europe and even the United States. Of course, his point of view is anchored in his political beliefs that were formed during the fascist period. And there is a certain reactionary tone in many of his judgment on the young people. On the other hand, we can find similar judgment in another flamboyant Italian writer, Pasolini. And it is very interesting that he was writing for Il Tempo, a very important Italian weekly. And when he died, after 1 year, his column was taken by Pasolini, that now we see as this icon of the left.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that. There, I see a lot of similarities
Yeah, yeah. it's
between
very-
them. Yeah, really interesting. I think it's-
Do you know anything about the book's reception in Russia? Would it have been published in the Soviet Union or
That
not
is a
till later?
fantastic question. I don't know. Has it been published? Do you know?
Okay, the Malaparte has been translated in Russian. Of course, some certain parts of Malaparte have been censored, and he became very prominent in Russia only after 1989, because of course before you cannot publish something like this in Soviet Russia. But he, as many things in Putin Russia, has been used as has been quoted also as an example of how corrupted was Russia before Putin. I was lucky enough to follow a PhD by a student from Università di Milano that traveled to Russia and like work on the Kremlin Ball, work on the many books that Malaparte wrote about Russia, from the Volga rises in Europe to Le Bonhomme Lenin and so on and so forth. And it was very, very interesting how his translations like flourished in the 90s and recently, and he has been used for ideological reasons.
Rolling over in his grave. Or not. Exactly,
Or not,
that's
or
true.
not,
Or not.
or
It's
not,
really
or
more
not,
to the
or
point.
not.
He's probably loving it. It's true. Yes.
What's the origin of Malaparte?
Uh,
It's born super.
Yeah, okay, so I did a lot of research on that. I'm sure you have the answer, but no. Yeah, apparently, where I got to, and then you correct me, was that he had found out that Bonaparte was a made-up name, and so he decided that he wanted to be Malaparte. So that's how he became Malaparte. But is there more to that? Yeah.
Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte, that wasn't made up. It was an Italian name, Bonaparte.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but apparently even Bonaparte,
It was made up.
it was made up.
Yeah, the family of Napoleon was a noble family from Liguria, and then they went to Corsica. But the original name, like in Tuscany you have Malaspina, and in Liguria you have Malaparte. But the family decided to call themselves Bonaparte for obvious reasons. So
And so Malaparte decided to be the real Malaparte.
Right, exactly.
The real Napoleon. So thank you all for coming.
yeah, thank you for coming.